In the wee hours of the morning on Wednesday, May 22nd, more than 100 NYPD officers executed a raid of a major Staten Island drug ring that's believed to have been responsible for multiple fatal overdoses in the community.
So we're talking about crack cocaine, fentanyl, and other types of drugs inside those apartments. So these are some really serious things that even children were subjected to. Mr. Mazzei, he was a pillar in the community. He had different programs where he claimed to have helped drug-ridden individuals and people who are suffering with addiction, helping them to go to different treatment centers and everything. So the shock is definitely there. He was somebody that people thought that they could trust. And in actuality, allegedly, he was the person supplying his very staffers and different people with these alleged drugs.
Welcome to the Staten Island Advances from the Scene, a podcast bringing you an inside look at the biggest stories on Staten Island with the reporters who cover them. I'm your host, Erik Bascome, and this week I'm joined by Staten Island Advance breaking news reporter Shaina McLawrence to discuss a massive takedown of a major drug distribution network here on Staten Island. Thanks for joining me today, Shaina.
Hi, Erik. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, anytime. And so it's been a little while since we've had you on the podcast. I was wondering kind of how everything's going over there in the world of crime and breaking news. We were talking the other day offline about how crime actually seems to be trending down here on Staten Island. So that's got to be exciting, right?
Yeah, so about 5% since last year. So 5% is, it's a really big deal, to be honest. So I'm happy to see that everything is trending down.
Yep, moving in the right direction. So happy to hear that as well. And so let's start to dig into this story. And there's so much to this that I'm not really sure where to begin, but I guess we'll start with that police raid that I was just talking about in the intro. Tell us a little bit about what happened here. And actually, first, before we even get into that, how did we find out about this? Is this something we knew that was coming, or were we kind of scrambling to figure out? How did this all kind of go down?
The Deputy Commissioner of Public Information reached out to us to extend the offer to what is called a ride-along, where journalists are invited to observe the NYPD do like a massive drug bust like the one I was able to observe. So my manager, Eddie, he said, this is what's happening, but they don't really give you the details as to like who, what, or even where until really like the morning of. It's really a tight-lipped thing. And I totally understand and get why it has to be, because on a ride-along of this scale, you don't want anything to potentially go awry, because that could cost lives, that could cost, months of investigative work. So that's really what happened. I was able to go there in the very early morning.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Tell me a little bit about that morning. When did you get there? Where were you guys set up? What did it look like? Just kind of paint the scene for us.
Okay, so I could paint partial partial part of the scene. So it was really early in the morning, about 3:00 in the morning.
Wow.
And we weren't too far from where Mr. Mazzei, we weren't too far from where his businesses were. So there were a whole bunch, way more police officers and investigators than I've ever seen in my life, from the highest ranks to, our foot patrol cops and everything. So everybody was in it 100%. They made a plan from clearly months and months of intense investigation. And, when the time was right, the very second was right. They waited till, were very patient and swooped in during the right time. And that's where we saw the scene unfold. Really thankful for the experience. I felt completely safe doing that. They did offer like a bulletproof vest. I was able to wear one. They're pretty warm, so it's like a little vest coat. Because although it's in May, just a couple, about a week or so ago, in the morning, it was pretty chilly out there. They were up, ready to go, ready for, I don't want to say the action, but ready to bring in those who were sought after and suspected of these levels of misdeeds.
Like you said, this was a huge operation. In reading some of our reporting, I saw that there was over 100 officers there. I think 125 was kind of the number that we had put it at.
Yeah.
And that before it all really went down, that one of the higher ranking officers, one of the chiefs, I believe, Jerry O'Sullivan, was kind of giving this speech to ramp up the officers, a bit of a pep talk almost, and saying things like what you were describing, like, this is a big day. Like, one of the quotes that got me was like, this is honestly what they make movies about. Like, this was a huge, huge operation there. So tell us a little bit about, once the raid starts, what happens? They're going into these locations, pulling people out in the morning, early morning. I imagine half of these people were sleeping, probably upset about the whole situation and getting... So what was some of the reaction like from the people who were being pulled out of these locations?
It ranged. Some were shameful when they got pulled out, and especially when they started to see the news cameras there. A lot of them were shameful and hid their faces from being photographed. Some of them were kind of a little bit angry. One man flashed a big grin to one of our photographers. So a really wide range of reactions. Another man, he was pulled out and he was like, expletive, expletive, expletive. I'm not going anywhere.
Thank you for saying that. So now Jason doesn't have to bleep it out on the podcast. We're saving him some work there.
Yes. But I'm not going anywhere until I have my kids, because apparently in that apartment building, when I say apartment building, it really wasn't like a really big apartment complex like you might see in like Far Rockaway or somewhere like that. So it wasn't so large, but I was really honestly surprised about the amount of people that they were able to bring out of those. So even so, like I said, there were kids inside of a place where police allegedly found drugs and guns. And when I say drugs, it's not, I don't want to say just, but like, we're not talking about marijuana and like a illegal smoke shop. It's much bigger than this. So we're talking about crack cocaine, fentanyl, and other types of drugs inside those apartments. So these are some really serious things that even children were subjected to.
Yeah, absolutely. Then this is obviously a very tough situation for everyone involved. And then when you throw kids into that mix, it just becomes even more complicated than it already was. So I want to talk a little bit about the investigation that led them to this raid. So we heard from District Attorney Michael McMahon that this was the result of, I believe, 2 years of ongoing investigation from the narcotics unit. And so can you tell us, what do we know so far about that 2 years? What exactly were they investigating? What type of evidence have they built to this point that allowed them to kind of execute this raid?
Well, they built a lot of evidence. So through different arrests from before, they were able to gather enough suspicion to be able to get warrants to execute this raid. I believe it was 9 search warrants and 21 arrest warrants or so for the individuals and the items that were in 3 different locations along the Bay Street area, including a catering hall that Mr. Mizai owned himself. So it's really a shocking thing to see all these little bits and pieces and breadcrumbs over the past 2 years led them to the doorstep of Mr. Mizai.
Yeah, and I had read in some of our reporting on this, and just to be clear, this is not all your reporting. This is a huge story. We've had our court reporter Kyle Lawson chipping in on this, and some other staff members as well contributing to this. But I had seen that there were ongoing wiretaps and that they were gathering evidence that way, that they had found some of these people had made sales to undercover officers. And so all of those piecing things together over the course of 2 years to finally be able to get these warrants and execute an operation of this magnitude. It was a lot of work. And so I wanna move on and talk about, we've mentioned him a little bit so far, and this is kind of their chief suspect in all of this. This was kind of their main target, and this is Ettore Mizai. And again, we do apologize if we're not 100% on that pronunciation there, but they have kind of alleged to this point that he was the mastermind of this operation, and that's come as a bit of a shock to some people because he was very, very well ingrained in the community, and it seemed very well liked in the community. He had been given awards from various organizations here. He had helped with, I believe, some of the business improvement districts and stuff of that nature. So Tell us a little bit more about Mr. Mazzei and about what is being alleged of him and where we're at with this whole thing.
So Mr. Mazzei recently was indicted by a grand jury. So to get indicted by a grand jury, for just a short explanation of what that means, the court convenes a grand jury to decide if there is enough evidence to move ahead or forward with the trial. And they decided, yes, there was. And he was indicted on 61 counts. He honestly was a very, like how he said, he was a pillar in the community. He had different programs where he claimed to have helped drug-ridden individuals and people who are suffering with addiction, helping them to go to different treatment centers and everything. So as far as the shock goes, the shock is definitely there. He was somebody that people thought that they could trust. And in actuality, allegedly, he was the person supplying his very staffers and different people with these alleged drugs.
Yeah, and so it really did come as a shock to many people I've seen. And as we had mentioned, he's been honored by various organizations here. The Staten Island Chamber of Commerce, just a couple of years ago, he received the Lewis R. Miller Business Leadership Award, which is, a big deal here on Staten Island. That's something that we cover typically each year when they're given out. So these are for local business people who are, community leaders and really helping Staten Island in so many different ways. And for him to kind of be living two separate lives here, right? He has this entrepreneur's pillar of the community, very civically engaged and all of this stuff. And then, what is being alleged of him is at the same time, he is running this giant narcotics ring that has resulted in multiple overdoses. It really is just crazy to think about. You never really know what is going on with any one person at any one time, as much as you may think that you know somebody. And again, all of this is allegations and will be figured out in the court of law, so we're not casting any aspersions. It's just difficult for people to kind of wrap their heads around, I think, sometimes. And so one of the things that stood out to me is that in addition to these drug trafficking charges, that we also had some financial crimes mixed in there, one of which specifically kind of stood out to me, talking about raiding a woman's finances after she had experienced a fatal overdose. So can you tell us a little bit more about that whole aspect of this?
He's accused of stealing the woman's information in 2022 in order to pilfer a life insurance policy. These are all, everything we're saying is backed up by court documents. This is a part of a 40-count indictment filed against him. He'll be facing a jury for that as well.
Yeah, and it's just crazy to think, as we say, that, obviously the main allegation and the cause of this massive raid was regards to this narcotics ring that he is running. So the idea that someone would be distributing and supplying the community with these illicit substances that may lead to overdose, and then when they do, to then allegedly go in and commit crimes to kind of profit off of the life insurance policy for the person who you are in some ways contributing to their overdose, allegedly. So that aspect of it just really kind of stood out to me.
I would also like to highlight that, unfortunately, this young lady who died, she wasn't the only person who died as a result of the alleged actions of Mr. Ettore. 5 overdoses have happened that all lead back to him, and I believe it's about 3 of them that resulted in fatalities. So those are some serious numbers, especially when we are talking about our small borough of only 500,000 people. My heart goes out to those families who have had loved ones. I mean, I think that's the biggest thing. Those families who lost their loved ones, they do deserve justice, and justice in any form. And I'm glad that they're finally getting justice for their loved ones. And, the court of law will prevail.
Yeah, absolutely. And so we had kind of reported a little bit after the fact, I had seen that this isn't his only recent run-in with the law, that there was actually an altercation that took place earlier this month regarding an assault and someone getting tossed through a window and all of this sort of stuff. And this had just happened a week before the raid. So can you tell me a little bit more about what was happening here?
One of the things that stood out to me during the raid is what they said. I can't quote directly which officer this was, but I did hear one say the thing that stood out to him the most was how he thought he was untouchable. So he was going around allegedly committing these financial crimes, and then all this stuff resulted in a physical altercation that led to an arrest. So prior to these run-ins with the law, he had a clean record. He was a person that in a system he wouldn't have been flagged. So it's really unfortunate that this is what has happened.
So just to touch on the incident that had occurred prior to this, we have some reporting around this. And on May 11th, Mr. Mazzei and his son David are alleged to have attacked a male victim outside Edgewater Hall, which, as we've mentioned, is where one of his businesses is located, saying that Mr. Mazzei had attempted to evict the victim for some time before the incident. That had obviously not happened. It had then escalated from a verbal argument into a physical assault. Mr. Mazzei is alleged to have struck the victim with a blunt object before the father and the son repeatedly punched and kicked the victim. Eventually, Mazzei is, again, allegedly grabbed the man and threw him through a window, shattering the glass. And so this is, again, weeks before we see what happens with this drug takedown. So this is obviously, like we said, someone who had not necessarily been viewed in this light publicly, but behind the scenes may have been operating in some of these unsavory manners, I guess would be one way to put it. So I just thought that was interesting that we're hearing that coming out right before this massive raid takes place. And so I think we might have described in the article, he appeared to be this upstanding citizen, but some cracks in the image started to come to light right before kind of this big takedown here. So you mentioned what you had heard from the police officers at the site about feeling as though he's untouchable or that he's impervious to any sort of consequences for his wrongdoing. But I'm just curious what else we've been hearing from either McMahon or from the NYPD about just sort of the extent of these crimes and the importance of these types of operations.
Yes, anti-drug advocacy is very near and dear to Mr. McMahon's heart. So he said before in a statement to the Advance that this is like a modern day like Fagin from Oliver Twist and, from Charles Dickens and everything, that this is a man who is allegedly totally the opposite of what he has portrayed himself to be. Mr. McMahon said, preyed on vulnerable people, and, he was pretty honestly ruthless. He said it was truly mind-boggling is his quote to say, and I can't help but 100% agree with him.
Yeah, and honestly, I want to just kind of read that quote as it is, because I thought that this was a very, very strong statement coming from McMahon on one of these situations. So the quote is, like a modern-day Fagin, the character from Dickens' Great Expectations, Mazzei preyed on vulnerable people who suffered from addiction illness and oppressed them into servitude in his catering business, for housing, and ultimately for drug dealing. The breadth of his criminal activity is truly mind-boggling. Mazzei built a labyrinth of crime, including drug dealing, extortion, and fraud against numerous government programs, including COVID-19 aid, housing support, food stamps, and other financial assistance. He is a successful businessman for sure, a crooked, evil businessman. And so that is a really, really strongly worded quote, as you said, and obviously all allegations to this point, but for someone to be in this position where you are taking vulnerable people or people who are struggling and saying, hey, I can help you and I can house you and I can give you a job, but then at the same time you're feeding into their issues and their illnesses that are plaguing them. It really is just, it paints a very dark picture for his intentions.
And I also just want to highlight just how far he weaved this web. I mean, McMahon said COVID-19 aid, housing support, food stamps, and other forms of financial assistance from the federal government and the state government. So he wasn't just allegedly selling and distributing these narcotics. He was also taking from innocent taxpayers and also some of New York's most vulnerable population through the food stamp system and stuff like that. So at the time, there's no question about it. Mr. Mazzei was a millionaire. So just to be able to do that, it's really, like Mr. McMahon said, mind-boggling.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you mentioned this earlier, that the issue of overdoses and getting narcotics off the street has really been a point of emphasis for McMahon in recent years. So I was wondering if before we go, you could just touch a little bit on that issue here on Staten Island and the extent of it, right? The number of lives lost and some of those different efforts from McMahon's office to try and crack down on this.
So Mr. McMahon does a whole bunch of different events and press conferences throughout the year to highlight drug overdose and bring light to drug awareness. He also is very vigilant in prosecuting alleged offenders of drug crimes. He also says, and is very real about it, that if you are committing a drug crime here on Staten Island, they will find you and they will prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law. So since Mr. McMahon took office in, I believe it was 2017, he made a few different programs. The name escapes me right now, but a few different programs to counteract drug overdose deaths, which is something that he is, like I said, very passionate about rectifying and ending on our borough.
Yeah, absolutely. And he has worked with various other elected officials here. I know that they have formed something of an overdose task force.
Yes.
That has been working on this issue. And just to kind of speak to the extent of it, this stat is a little bit old. So this is from September 2023. But at that time, according to McMahon's office, more than 830 Staten Islanders had died of an overdose since 2016. So just quickly doing the math, you've got about 7-8 years there. 830 Staten Islanders, that's more than 100 Staten Islanders a year losing their lives to overdose. And so anytime that they can conduct an investigation and operation of this magnitude and be able to shut down what was allegedly a major distribution network here on Staten Island, I think that is a major win for the community, and that's a community that, as we said, has suffered so much from this epidemic in recent years. So it was really, really, really strong reporting by you and everybody else on the team. And so I want to thank you so much for joining me today, and hope to have you back on soon.
Thank you so much for having me.
Anytime, and absolutely a job well done on the part of the NYPD. Thank you for listening to the Staten Island Advances from the Scene. If you like what you've heard, please make sure to rate and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and visit silive.com for the latest on all these stories and more. Thank you for supporting local journalism.